There are clearly four kinds of monastics. First, there are the cenobites, that is to say, those who belong to a monastery where they serve under a rule and an abbot or prioress. Benedict is going to talk about several different types of monastics within the first chapter. And before you switch off and say, well, I'm not a monastic, this doesn't apply to me, pay very close attention to how Saint Benedict has very clearly in his mind what he desires for the specific kind of community he's trying to build. Remember, this is the first part of his rule. And in describing what kinds of monastics there are, he is going to give you where his own spiritual philosophy is as to how we make good Christians. Now, the first type of monastic he describes are cenobites. Cenobites are perhaps the most recognizable because they are, in fact, what Benedict is trying to write this book for. Because cenobites, in and of themselves, are people who have submitted themselves to a rule of life, a rule of community, and have decided to live together in obedience to a superior. Now, while Benedict in the first chapter points out that he's not into mere acts of religiosity just for their own sake, as if we are in some ways training up our own spirituality, our own favor with God. That's not how it happens. It's only through Jesus that we are favored with God. But he also is very clear that training is not out of the question when it comes to the growth in holiness. If you remember last week, we neither want to lay upon someone something undue and burdensome, but we do hold to a little strictness in order to do what? In order to grow in love and in order to correct fault. So, for Benedict, cenobites are exactly who he's writing this rule for. But what's more telling is who he's not writing this book for. Second, there are anchorites, or hermits, who have come through the test of living in a monastery for a long time and have passed beyond the first fervor of monastic life. Thanks to the help and guidance of many, they are now trained to fight against evil. They have built up their strength and go from the battle line in the ranks of their members to the single combat of the desert. Self-reliant now, without the support of another, they are ready with God's help to grapple single-handedly with the vices of body and mind. There's a notion in our society that if only I could just get away from other people, then I could truly discover myself. If only I could get rid of all other factors in my life, then maybe I could know something of my own self. But if you read Benedict's line carefully about anchorites, Benedict says exactly the opposite. In fact, anchorites only can become anchorites, only can become that way after living an entire life in the monastery. Notice very carefully, he says that only after many people, many have aided in this anchorite learning and growing, and in some cases disciplining themselves in the community of people, only then can we leave the life of others for single combat, so to speak. It is only after training in community for many, many years that we can embark on this, or that we have any chance to embark on this. It's not a glib spirituality that says, well, if only I can get rid of other people, then I can become spiritual. Rather, Benedict says, no, it is only through community that you can become strong enough to stand on your own. It is only by others that you can stand before God by his goodwill. Or, to use a line of another very famous monk, my life and my death are with my neighbors. There is no separation between the spiritually fit person and living in community. One can take on a particular set of solitary sorts of spirituality only when one has been through the trials and crucible of living together. And it's helpful to note that Benedict himself, earlier in life, looked to become a hermit himself. And, as Sister Joan puts it, discovers that actually, in a very funny way, that the hermit life was not nearly as sanctifying as learning to live in community. Which again is why Benedict is going to emphasize you must stay in the monastery with the community. That is how you grow in holiness, not separating yourself arbitrarily into a singular sort of hermit state. Only after a lifetime in the monastery can you do so, and only after a lifetime of living in community is it even safe to try. Third, there are Cerebites, the most detestable kind of monastics who, with no experience to guide them, no rule to try them as gold is tried in a furnace, have a character as soft as lead. Still loyal to the world by their actions, they clearly lie to God by their signs of religion. 2 or 3 together, or even alone without a shepherd, they pen themselves up in their own sheepfolds, not God's. Their law is to do what they like, whatever strikes their fancy. Anything they believe in and choose they call holy. Anything they dislike they consider forbidden. Cerebites, as Benedict calls them, are a kind of monastic that exists within the 6th century. This is before there are official codification of orders within the church. After all, the monastic movement takes a fair bit before they become institutionalized within the regular life of the church and encouraged by the regular curia. The Cerebites were, before the orders were, again, before that they were institutionalized, anybody could take up the habit of a monk and pretend to be a monastic. And in Benedict's time, you could see those people regularly. They say that they divide themselves into a community, but rather it is a religious show only. They show acts of religiosity that Benedict say are utterly empty because they do not obediently submit themselves to a rule or a superior. Rather, they have an outward form of spirituality while inwardly they are dead. Pretending to be religious, they make themselves great in the eyes of those who look at them, when in fact, inwardly, they are worse than when they started. Benedict detests these because they have not taken any serious vows, any serious commitment to really mortifying their vices. Rather, Benedict says their vices are simply encouraged by their religiosity. They are submitted to the vice of whatever they want, and they are not, in the sense of a community, beholden to anyone but themselves. This is a fair bit too close to modern spirituality, in which when we separate ourselves from the ancient practices of tried and true methods, we try to make up new ways of spirituality. Sooner or later, we have to sort of admit to ourselves that we have only simply constructed a convenient spirituality. This is often the case with some of our modern day sort of spiritual gurus, that there is a hollowness to the sort of practice that they set out to say is appropriate. And yet when one takes a look at historical practice, we learn that the discipline necessary to take on for any of these sort of spiritual practices is one that you must take on in community. Something that you must take on in the company of others and not individually. I could say much more about this, but suffice to say, spirituality is not what Benedict is about. Benedict is about growth in holiness, rubbing against the sharp edges of those for whom we are submitted under. And not just monastics, but even those of us who are not monastics are subject to others if we are to live a spiritual life. We are subject to the needs of our spouse, of our children, of our parents, whether they be old or young. We are subject to a superior that in the very best sense is not meant for anything less than our sanctification. And once we throw off those superiors and throw off those rules and pursue our own way, Benedict says we become even more lost than we were in the first place. Fourth and finally, there are monastics called gyrovagues, who spend their entire lives drifting from region to region, staying as guests for 3 or 4 days in different monasteries, always on the move. They never settle down and are slaves to their own wills and gross appetites. In every way, they are worse than Cerebites. It is better to keep silent than to speak of all of these in their disgraceful way of life. Let us pass by them, then, with the help of God, proceed to draw up a plan for the strong kind, the Cenobites. The gyrovagues, other than having a very fascinating name, are a kind of monastic that is a wandering monastic. A monastic that goes from one place to another. And in fact, Sister Joan points out that the beginnings of the gyrovagues really had a noble intention. Because, as we read in the Gospels, that Christ Jesus had no place to lay his head, the Son of Man has no place to stay, the gyrovagues initially were attempting to imitate Christ in that they had no place to stay. Now, some of you might immediately think to yourselves, now wait a minute, wasn't St. Francis and the Franciscans sort of after that spirituality? Well, first of all, you have to think, St. Francis doesn't come on the scene for another 800 years after St. Benedict, or at 600 to 800, depending on when you date, when this rule occurs. But it doesn't occur for another significant period of time. And so Benedict is talking about something very specific in his community. And what Benedict is talking about are the types of monastics that instead of planting themselves, such as when a seed falls into the ground and becoming rooted in a particular context, what Benedict says that gyrovagues are tempted to, which is worse than he says Cerebites, is that they become subject to their own kind of spiritual pride. They, in their wandering, become an undue burden on the people for whom they go and visit. And to kind of put it this way, they are someone who they show up, they rely on the begging and the needing of the community. They stay with the monastic communities for maybe 3 or 4 days and then move on. They don't stay long enough to do any real work. And as we're going to see here in just a little bit, Benedict is so clear about the necessity of prayer and work that for anybody to simply go wandering around, Benedict says, how can you ever grow in spiritual strength? How can you ever mortify the vices that tempt you if you are not established in a place and focused enough to subject yourselves to a rule? Whenever you are wandering aimlessly or going from place to place, Benedict says you are subject to the worst kind of vice, which is the type of vice that is a burden on any community that is trying to do good work. Rather, he returns and says, we're going to pass over the gyrovagues. We're not going to talk about the Cerebites. We're not even going to talk about the anchorites. The anchorites it's assumed that the anchorites are formed in the Cenobite community. And so Benedict says clearly, we are writing a rule for the Cenobites, those who are going to subject themselves in community under a rule, under a superior, and who are going to ever so slowly and consistently live out their sanctification in the community of Christ, centered around the prayer and the work of the monastic community. To be worthy of the task of governing a monastery, the prioress or abbot must always remember what the title signifies and act accordingly. They are believed to hold the place of Christ in the monastery. Therefore, a prioress or abbot must never teach or decree or command anything that would deviate from God's instructions. On the contrary, everything they teach and command should, like the leaven of divine justice, permeate the minds of the community. In 6th century Rome, to be the head of any sort of organization, whether that be the empire, whether that be the family, whether that be the church even, there was a secular tendency towards domination. After all, the dominion over these certain organizations was seen to be held supremely and only by the head of that organization. This is a little bit of the tradition behind the emperors of Rome being incarnate deities, something called the cult of the emperor. And this is actually seen even in the time of Christ, because after Julius Caesar, who was seen to be a god incarnate as the first emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus was also titled the Son of God, the son of Julius. And so the supreme rule over certain organizations was held by the head of that organization. However, it should be noted very kind of interestingly how completely countercultural Saint Benedict's understanding of the qualifications of an abbot or prioress is for the monastic community. Because the abbot or prioress is not the head of that organization. No, it's very, very specifically, they are the presence of Christ in the community. Notice that they are not, in and of themselves, dominating the community in their own sort of way, but they themselves are subject to the will of Christ. They are, in a very serious sense, the presence of Christ in the community, to be the mind of Christ in the community, but they are utterly not given the same, even the same linguistic level of authority that any of the surrounding 6th century Roman culture would have readily recognized. Rather, they are given a very different kind of authority. They are holding up for the monastic community Christ, and they are themselves subject to Christ. They are not an emperor. They are not someone who holds mere domineering authority in the 6th century sense over that organization. They instead are something profoundly different. Let the prioress or abbot always remember that at the judgment of God, not only their teaching, but also the community's obedience will come under scrutiny. The prioress and abbot must therefore be aware that the shepherd will bear the blame whenever the owner of the household finds that the sheep have yielded no profit. Still, if they have faithfully shepherded a restive and disobedient flock, always striving to cure their unhealthy ways, it will be otherwise. The shepherd will be acquitted at God's judgment. Then, like the prophet, they may say to God, "I have not hidden your justice in my heart. I have proclaimed your truth and your salvation, but they spurned and rejected me." Then, at last, the sheep that have rebelled against their care will be punished by the overwhelming power of death. Benedict has a very beautiful way of describing communal responsibility in this passage. And again, it should be readily clear as to how this applies far more generally than simply to who an abbot or a prioress is as the spiritual leader of a monastery. Rather, it should be fairly clear that the responsibility of sound teaching is truly upon the abbot and prioress, but not solely. In other words, the abbot or prioress is not judged as successful or unsuccessful based upon whether they train up Christians. That's not what they are doing in the monastery. Again, they are the presence of Christ for the monastery. They are presenting to the monastery Christ. And in the very best way, they are presenting and representing the judgment of God over the holiness that is demanded of those for whom are living under the rule. And insofar as that's the case, the abbot or prioress is never judged as successful or unsuccessful based upon their own strength. Rather, they are based as successful or unsuccessful upon their faithfulness. As Benedict says, have they presented the teaching of God? Have they presented the instructions of God? If they have done so, even the most disobedient and unhelpful monastic community is still a line of sanctification, at least for the abbot or the prioress. They have done their faithful work. Likewise, the monks and nuns of the monastery, they have personal responsibility. It's not merely, did I please the abbot by my actions? No, the abbot and the prioress are pointing beyond themselves to Christ. The question for the monastic is, am I obedient to Christ? And likewise, if I'm obedient to Christ, the abbot in their teaching should show forth Christ. Now, once again, the abbot or the prioress, if they are not showing forth Christ, also is not something that is indicative of whether the flock is saved. Those who are faithful to Christ are the ones that will be sanctified and saved. It's not indicative on either the spiritual leadership, whether good or bad, neither is it implicated by how good or bad your flock is. It has everything to do with whether we are subject to Christ. And that, again, is why this is such a countercultural sort of thing that Benedict is proposing. The line of measuring success is not whether the leadership has trained up good soldiers, so to speak, and it is not in whether the monks, nuns, or those who are under the rule are becoming what they're supposed to become. None of that is the case. Rather, it is subject only unto Christ. And therefore, the environment of the monastery is one of mutual support, of both the abbot and prioress needing the community, and the community needing the abbot and prioress, but all of them needing God. Furthermore, those who receive the name of prioress or abbot are to lead the community by a twofold teaching. They must point out to the monastics all that is good and holy more by example than by words, proposing God's commandments to a receptive community with words, but demonstrating God's instructions to the stubborn and the dull by a living example. Again, if they teach the community that something is not to be done, then neither must they do it, lest after preaching to others they themselves be found reprobate, and God some day call to them in their sin, "How is it that you repeat my just commands and mouth my covenant when you hate discipline and toss my words behind you? And also this, how is it that you can see a splinter in another's eye and never notice the plank in your own?" Integrity is a word that means to live an integral sort of way, integrating both what we say and what we do, even to go so deep as to what we think matches what we say and do. To live a life of integrity is to live a life consistently. there is no inconsistence between what we say, what we do, and likewise, there is no inconsistence between what we ask of others, because we ourselves believe and do what we ask others to do as well. In the Roman Empire in the 6th century, it was so easy for heads of communities to simply make demands upon their inferiors to serve their own wills. This was readily recognized as a right of the powerful. And yet Benedict turns this on its head and says, again, the abbot or prioress is not a domineering sort of person that simply serves their own will. They, in fact, themselves are subject to Christ. And instead of the monastics of the monastery being in mere servitude to their abbot or prioress, rather, what is meant to be is for the abbot and prioress to be just as much enmeshed in the community as to be needing the same things. They simply are taking on a mantle of leadership for the good of the community and not for their own gain. We can think of all kinds of extremely destructive sorts of ways in which one's authority is used in order to subject, intimidate, or bully followers into line. We can think of military commanders, politicians even, that use their seats of authority to bully others into servitude to them and their agendas. But in fact, Benedict says exactly the opposite of what the abbot or prioress must do. They instead must live with such integrity and consistency that there is nothing that they ask of the community that they are not also going to work for themselves. They ask of the community because they are also asking of themselves. Likewise, they serve the community in such a way that they are serving Christ, not themselves. And this goes, again, far beyond a simple abbot or prioress of a monastery. But anyone for whom is a leader. Leaders, in a very simple biblical sense, as Benedict points us back to, are not people who are above their inferiors. To live as such is to live destructive lives. But rather, leaders are those for whom are a part of the community, of which they are a part of, and likewise will demand of themselves the same things that they demand of others. It is not a bad thing to demand prayer from the inferiors of the monastery. But that means that prayer is demanded of the abbot or prioress as well. Likewise, it is to live a life of integrity, because the abbot or prioress is showing forth the presence of Christ, not their own domineering wills. The prioress or abbot should avoid all favoritism in the monastery. They are not to love one more than another unless they find someone better in good works and obedience. One born free is not to be given higher rank than one born a slave who becomes a monastic, except for some other good reason. But the prioress and abbot are free if they see fit to change anyone's rank as justice demands. Ordinarily, all are to keep to their regular places because whether slave or free, we are all one in Christ, and share equally in the service of one God, for God shows no partiality among persons. Only in this are we distinguished in God's sight, if we are found better than others in good works and in humility. Therefore, the prioress and abbot are to show equal love to everyone and apply the same discipline to all according to their merits. As we're going to see here in a couple of chapters, the abbot or prioress has very much sole responsibility in appointing monastics to various parts of the monastic life. Some cook the food. Some tend the gardens. Some do the business transactions of the monastery. In a very serious way, they all form a community of people with differing gifts. But the thing about what St. Benedict is laying out for the prioress and the abbot in choosing who is to serve in these roles is not upon any other line of merit than under Christ's grace. In the monastic community of St. Benedict, it's helpful to understand that in the ways in which one is higher or lower rank, so to speak, is based upon absolutely nothing other than when one comes to Christ. Those who are grown in holiness, those who have been a baptized Christian for longer than others, is the only thing that separates someone in some spiritual or practical way. There is nothing else in this world that affects that spiritual rank. And Benedict, again, is trying to say something very important here. This is especially true when it comes to our modern day sensibilities of trying to climb the social ladder. Well, I'm at this baseline job so that I can work myself up to becoming more favored or more powerful or earn more money, so on and so forth, rather than what the job actually is. Now, it might be unfair, at least in the more general sense, to talk about this because people take jobs not merely to do the job, but to feed their families, right? But if we strip away all of those other things, does someone do a job because they are gifted by God to do so? Or do they do a job because they are trying to climb the social ladder? How many of us would at least care to admit that there are some social positions in our lines of work that we would rather have because of the fact that it gives us more power, because of the fact that it gives us more economic power, more social power, so on and so forth? Benedict makes very clear that's not how the monastery works. Rather, one does the work at the monastery that one is gifted by the grace of God in, not by any other sort of favoritism. And hence, when the abbot or prioress makes the decisions as to which monastics do certain things, they are to do so in utter equity. And especially at this time, whenever it was a real possibility that one is a slave or one is a free person, given the sorts of structures at the 6th century time, Benedict makes very clear it does not matter what one's family heritage is. It matters who they are in Christ alone. And so that is how the abbot or prioress is to make decisions as to who does what, and how one understands the rank of a monastic. But again, it's so apparent how obvious that is supposed to be for us in the more general sense. We are never meant to play favorites when it comes to anyone. We are to live out our various vocations and spiritual callings with the integrity of knowing what we do is for others, not for self. And in the decisions of the abbot and prioress, even the head of the organization must subject themselves to that biblical virtue. In their teachings, the prioress or abbot should always observe the apostles' recommendation in which it is said, use argument, appeal, reproof. This means that they must vary with circumstances, threatening and coaxing by turns, at times stern, at times devoted and tender. With the undisciplined and restless, they will use firm argument. With the obedient and docile and patient, they will appeal for greater virtue. But as for the negligent and disdainful, we charge the abbot or prioress to use reproof and rebuke. They should not gloss over the sins of those who err, but cut them out while they can, as soon as they begin to sprout, remembering the fate of Eli, priest of Shiloh. For the upright and perceptive, the first and second warnings should be verbal, but those who are evil or stubborn, arrogant or disobedient can be curbed only by blows or some other physical punishment at the first offense. It is written, the fool cannot be corrected with words, and again, strike your children with the rod, and you will free their souls from death. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, we meet a priest called Eli, and he is a priest at the temple at Shiloh. And when Eli beholds Hannah, who comes before the Lord to pray for a son, he initially believes that she is drunk. And Hannah says, I'm not drunk, I am pouring out myself before the Lord. Well, the Lord hears Hannah and grants her a son, and his name is Samuel, who becomes the great prophet and judge of Israel, Samuel. And Samuel learns under Eli the priest at Shiloh. But one of the things that we find out is that when the Lord calls Samuel the first time in 1 Samuel chapter 3, the first word that the Lord gives to Samuel is judgment on Eli's house because of the wickedness of his sons. In other words, the sons of Eli have grown and have done some pretty terrible things. You can read of the story if you want to in 1 Samuel chapters 3 and 4. But what Benedict brings up is that sin in the concepts of the monastery is that which is the main thing that must be cut out at the root. Sin, in its full flowering, as St. Paul says, brings death. And St. Benedict, because Benedict is writing this rule for the way of life, instructs the prioress and abbot that their chief means of authority is entrusted to them to prevent the death of their inferiors. They are meant to prevent the spiritual death of those for whom they are charged, just like any good shepherd protects the sheep from wolves. Well, insofar as doing that, Benedict is also very clear that this is not some authoritarian, one-size-fits-all corporal punishment sort of thing. This is not something that every single person for the sins of another are going to receive punishment upon their own merits, but rather, St. Benedict is deeply personal in this, and makes it very clear that he's deeply personal. St. Benedict, in fact, says, what we must do instead is we must, in fact, work with people where they are. Benedict says very clearly, if we are to reprove, if we are to rebuke, we are to do so only when necessary. We are to use argumentation, reproof, and to use those various avenues at our disposal, but only in very, very understanding and clear circumstances. Just like you would not punish a child who has been perfectly acceptable and good in their behavior in the classroom, so also you are not going to just gloss over a child that is running absolutely out of control. Rather, for each of them, a particular approach is necessary. For the child who cannot control themselves, a certain amount of restraint is necessary. But for the child who is listening, who is trying their best, who you can tell is doing what they're supposed to, we use gentler language. We use a verbal word of encouragement. But Benedict is saying no different with the monastics. Just as we are not to show favoritism for monastics who we might like better than others, so also we are never to shy away from the root point of what the abbot and the prioress are meant to drive out from the community, which is the root of sin. Any such sort of sin is destructive for the community and destructive to the person. Therefore, the abbot or prioress must in very personable cases, take on the approach that is going to be most effective in driving that sin out. And for different people, that means different approaches. The prioress and abbot must always remember what they are and remember what they are called, aware that more will be expected of one to whom more has been entrusted. They must know what a difficult and demanding burden they have undertaken, directing souls and serving a variety of temperaments, coaxing, reproving, and encouraging them as appropriate. They must so accommodate and adapt themselves to each other's character and intelligence that they will not only keep the flock entrusted to their care from dwindling, but will rejoice in the increase of a good flock. The name abbot, or abbess, the name of prior or prioress, is in a very serious sense derived from the root word abba, father or mother. And in that case, the abbot or abbess, the prior or the prioress, is meant to be a spiritual father or mother to their community. They're not, as Sister Joan would say, they're not either military commanders or camp counselors. They are not someone who you go to for only the practical side of life and not for the nurturing side. But also, hidden within these couple of sentences, the abbot or the abbess, the prior or the prioress, is also subject to their Father in heaven. And what they are serving as in the monastic community, the coaxing, encouraging, the bringing about of holiness for those under their charge, is no less than the call to be spiritual father and mother of the community. Fathers and mothers are leaders, but they are also deeply, deeply encouraging. They are constantly there. They are disciplining. But importantly, fathers and mothers in this life are not perfect. And the abbot and the prior, the abbess and the prioress, are to constantly behold their vision, both the nurturing aspect of understanding the weaknesses of those for whom they are charged over, but only through the understanding of their own weaknesses. They are not called to be any less than completely embracing of their role as being the humble father and mother of the spirits of those for whom that they have been charged. And in order to be so, they have to be deeply and intimately aware of their own failings, their own weaknesses, so that perhaps in a very similar way of the book of Hebrews, when it says that Jesus is a high priest that can sympathize with us in our weakness because he has been through everything we have, so also the abbot or the prioress does the same. They, through their understandings of their own weaknesses, their own failings, can understand in humility the needs of those who are assailed by the same things. They're not meant to be spiritual gurus giving people instructions as to what they should be doing, but they are rather instead to be intimately entwined in the community exactly because they know how broken they are. Above all, they must not show too great a concern for the fleeting and temporal things of this world, neglecting or treating lightly the welfare of those entrusted to them. Rather, they should keep in mind that they have undertaken the care of souls for whom they must give an account. That they may not plead lack of resources as an excuse, they are to remember what is written. Seek first the reign and justice of God, and all these things will be given to you as well. And again, those who reverence the Holy One lack nothing. This is where Benedict can be utterly contrasted with the sort of machinery of modern day. Whereas in modern day, we are always so concerned with the physical means and expectations of others, such as the physical output that we are putting, the products on the shelf, and the meals we put on the table at night, Benedict says something very striking and says to be more concerned with the spiritual health of those who are charged under them than their physical ones. Now, this might seem to be an extreme step, and how can you possibly not care for the physical as well as the spiritual? Why not say hold those things in a balance? Well, it's for a very specific and important reason. And Benedict sort of puts it this way. In order to really be concerned with the eternal fate of someone's soul, we have to think to ourselves, what is the more important thing? What is the more important thing between making a fast from a meal and entering into the kingdom of heaven? The physical characteristics of missing a meal, it's not all that great for us to miss meals and to go about hungry. Benedict knows that. But what Benedict is more concerned with is, are we actually growing in the ways in which eternity is going to be measured? Are we mortifying our flesh in the ways that we can while we have time on this mortal earth? Are we, in fact, subjecting ourselves to the greater work of sanctification rather than the mere temporal work of feeding our bodies every day? Now, once again, Benedict is not saying that the abbot should simply starve their flock so that their spirits can be well. It's not what he's saying. Rather, what he's saying is that we as spiritual leaders have to keep in front of ourselves that spiritual health is what we prioritize. Benedict knows very well there are all kinds of other ways, even in his community, that you can prioritize the bodily self, the physical self. Hedonism existed just as much back then as it does in modern day, the serving of our own appetites alone. But rather, Benedict says we must subject our appetites, both spiritual and physical, to the more important goal of becoming spiritually fit. This is why fasting is a spiritual practice. We are depriving ourselves of a physical sort of sustenance that we might focus on that which is eternal. We are taking away something, we are depriving ourselves of something for the purposes of spiritual training. That is what the abbot or prioress must have first and foremost in their minds. Not to say that we're neglecting the physical, because of course, as practical-minded as Benedict is, he's not saying that. But rather, we have to keep the main things the main things. Those who live under the rule are subjecting themselves to a spiritual discipline, primarily a spiritual discipline. And insofar as it's a spiritual discipline, we have to take very seriously the fact that we are prioritizing the spiritual rather than simply the temporal. The prioress and abbot must know that anyone undertaking the charge of souls must be ready to account for them. Whatever the number of members they have in their care, let them realize that on Judgment Day they will surely have to submit a reckoning to God for all their souls, and indeed for their own as well. In this way, while always fearful of the future examination of the shepherd about the sheep entrusted to them, and careful about the state of others' accounts, they become concerned also about their own, and while helping others to amend by their warnings, they achieve the amendment of their own faults. The abbot and prioress are not simply leaders for the sake of others alone. They also are accountable before God for their own spiritual fitness. To go back to something Benedict said earlier, it is not a measure of success for the abbot or prioress, or for the community as a whole, on either the abbot or prioress's ability to get, as Benedict said, a wayward, dull, and stubborn flock to become holy, but neither is it about the abbot or prioress simply training up themselves to be spiritually superior to others. Rather, it is in a give and take in community that is based upon faithfulness to Jesus, not upon anything exterior that we might say we are worth more than others. But likewise, just as we are under the mercy and grace of God as faithful followers, we are also responsible before God and others. The abbot and prioress are responsible to God for those souls in their care. Therefore, they are to conduct themselves in a supremely holy and just fashion. But it is not based upon the success of the flock that the abbot or prioress will be judged, but rather it is upon their spiritual integrity, their spiritual maturity, upon which they are weighed. It is a paradox, perhaps, that those who are teachers, as the book of St. James tells us, teachers will be subject to a much higher form of judgment before God. And yet, at the same time, their judgment is bound up in their particular spiritual condition and not upon the condition of other people. It is a paradox that both of these things are true. It's a mysterious sort of way in which these abbots and prioresses and likewise spiritual leaders and those who are set over the care of souls in the Christian community are in fact subject both to the judgment of those under their care, they are subject both to the souls under their care and their care before God, but they are also subject to their own spiritual maturity themselves. They are to hold both of these in tension, and likewise they are to hold both of them seriously. No one can be an abbot, prioress, spiritual leader, priest, deacon, bishop, so on and so forth, who is in spiritual charge of souls and not hold both of these things in tension. There is a necessity for these tethering ties to pull in these directions. In the best way, though, both of these tethering ties are pulling in the same direction, that both the care of those under the charge of the spiritual leader sanctifies the leader themselves, but also that the recognition of the charge in which they are put in is something that deepens the spiritual leader's sense of closeness to the presence of Christ. Both of these things can be true, and both of these things are what Benedict requires and demands of anyone who would call themselves an abbot or prioress of the community in which are living under this rule.